Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 553, Face Quilt. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I am here to tell you that there is a very, very talented young man in Thing 2's AP art class, and we are putting the picture of his face quilt onto the show notes. Oh my good grief. I couldn't believe it. Aiden sent me this picture earlier this week and said, look what one of the guys in my class did. It's gorgeous. It's a face quilt, and it actually looks like him. So that will be on the show notes. If you're having trouble finding the show notes, just so you know, we've rebuilt the Craftlit site, but that broke a Libsyn thing. So you can still find all of the show notes at craftlit.libsyn, that's libsyn.com. You can find all the show notes there. I am going to have to spend the weekend fixing this one particular problem on the Craftlit site. And then the new Shukmakeki will be ready for your access, consumption, enjoyment, and pause for appreciation of its beauty. It's nice. I like it. What else? Maya Daguerre has figured out the tip jar situation. So there will be a new link that you can access to make sure that you can send your love in a supportive kind of way to Maya. Voicemail 206-350-1642. You can leave a message for Craftlit that I can play for everyone should you want to. Again, 206-350-1642. And today we have a couple of voicemails from Tara. Here we go.
Hello, Heather. It is I, Tara Worcester, yet again. The wind is crazy here in Middle Tennessee, such so that it has blown the power out in my neighborhood. There's 18 blocks of us who are just no power. And I am eternally grateful for cellular data and Craftlit and YouTube, and to talk about how incredibly perfect Ms. Banner is. If she could be any more perfect, she would, but she can't because she is immense perfection. To the point of, she just posted a video of a brief history of women's pockets. They weren't always so disgraceful. It's delightful. I only just started it, and I realized that, one, I must share this information. She only just posted it yesterday, I believe. And, two, I still have to finish the episode of Northanger Abbey. So I'm going to go tackle up pockets and then enjoy Northanger and then go listen to last episode again because Thing 2's music is amazing. Hey, Thing 2. This is your multi-state away conscience telling you to make a Spotify playlist. I really need a Spotify playlist. I don't have the Apple Music on my phone because it's just stupid, and I refuse to use it. Can you make a Spotify playlist? Please? Maybe Auntie Tara would like one. Thank you. I hope you're having a great day, Heather. I'm going to go laugh about pockets and then listen to Northanger Abbey and hope the power comes back on soon. Hello, Heather. It is Tara Worcester, and since you insist, I will not finish the episode before I call you with some insights and information. So, calling cards. Let's delve into calling cards. If you want a brief rundown of how important calling cards are, one of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Little House books has the whole spiel of Laura actually buying her own name cards or calling cards. There's this whole, what font do I get? Do I get it embossed? Do I have it raised? All these other things. Oh, I like colors. And then Mary, who's blind, spoilers, is like, oh, these feel nice. I like how this feels. And it's a whole ordeal about buying pieces of paper to put your name on to leave when you go visiting in a prairie town where there's like 6 people that you can go visiting. But it's a really big deal because that calling card, and I think you've expressed this exact thing in a previous episode, that is your introduction to the person. You give either the butler or the valet. It's either the butler or the valet. It's never a footman who answers the door, because that is highly insulting to have the lowest rung guy answer your front door. That's bad. It's either the butler or the valet, and that's it. You give him the card. He takes the card to the lady of the house or the man of the house, whoever you're calling on, and then she will look at that card, and depending on the quality of the paper, the font, if there's a picture, the printing of it, if it's smudged, if it's wrinkled, if it's got, schmutz on it, all these things, your first introduction is that card. If she doesn't like the look of your card, she will, no, I'm not here. And honestly, sometimes when the butler comes back and goes, oh, I'm sorry, the lady is out, 9 times out of 10, she's actually out of the house because it's not his job to keep tabs on exactly where she is. Whose job is that? That is the lady's maid's job. It's not his job, it is the lady's maid. So he will go find the lady's maid or the head of house, which is usually the one female in charge of all the other maids in the house, and will ask, is the lady about? Oh, no, she's not. Or the butler or valet will go ask the husband, is the lady of the house here? And 9 times out of 10, no, she's off doing her own thing. It is very rarely where she's actually in the house. She's off visiting or shopping or on a walk attending something. She doesn't always is at home, but sometimes she is, and if that card is unfavorable, she will dismiss you, and to the point of take card and toss into fire. Goodbye. And that is the biggest insult anyone can ever do you, is to take your calling card and either rip it and pitch it in the dirt or pitch it in the fire. So that's one of those things. And sometimes if the butler or valet knows that you are troublesome, he won't even present the card to anyone. He will literally slip it up his coat sleeve, give a 5-minute walk to that room, walk leisurely back to the front door. I'm sorry, they are not home. We have your card. Thank you. And that's one of the very intricate and slightly mischievous ondoings and ongoings in a larger house. It's very interesting to know. So again, one of the later Laura Ingalls Wilder books, it's before she decides to marry Almanzo, and when Mary comes back from college. So it's a very niche point right there. I can't remember which book it is, but it's one of the later ones where they're in the prairie town. But yes, so calling cards and big house etiquette. Always a butler, never a footman. I hope you're having a great day, Heather. And I cannot wait to listen to this episode. And I swear to God, if that one brother keeps up his shenanigans, I could pummel him with a shoe. A really, really big one. A shoe. I'll talk to you later, Heather. Bye.
So first off, I am sorry to say that you're probably going to want to get the shoes out at some point today, Tara. Second off, Thing 2 does not have a Spotify playlist. He has a song on Spotify. I am haranguing him right now for other options. At some point, Boy will get his act together and get that for you. But shoes, yes, the pummel with the shoe. I have a feeling we're all going to get there. If we're not there already. He's just such a twit. Ah. All right, so things to know for today's chapters. I was shocked when I finally went through all my notes and realized for 2 chapters that I didn't think were that heavy with information, there's actually a bunch of stuff going on. First and most importantly, I think I can say with some amount of confidence that this is true for both chapters. Anything Isabella does or says is all either lies or bad taste, done in bad taste, said in bad taste, or both. I think that's accurate. I don't think that's hyperbolic. Just a reminder, she and her family, when they are not in Bath, they live in Putney, which is west of London along the Thames. Richmond is going to get mentioned. Richmond is closer to London, very fashionable, very money. So it would be a big move up to go at this time from Putney to Richmond, just to localize that in your head. Unlike the Enchanted Chocolate Pot books, made it out to seem, foreign travel at this time, leaving Britain and traveling on the continent, really wasn't done a whole lot right now. I mean, we know that within 30 years, the Brontes are going to Brussels and all of that. Right now, not so much. There were wars going on. Several, many, lots all over the place. Wars kind of made it not such a great place to go visit right then. So the thought that somebody might have gone traveling, especially a young somebody, would have been really quite a surprise. Along with Isabella's lies and bad taste, I think we've figured out that her use of slang at the time, is vast. Amazingly, when things are just so amazingly wonderful, that's in there. Stupid is something she doesn't say, but it is a term that is used rather differently than it is now. Generally, it would just kind of mean slow. When I get up from a nap and I'm groggy, that would be feeling stupid. Does that make sense? It's not, wow, you're so stupid. Why'd you do that? It's not that kind of stupid. But you're going to hear more of Isabella's slangy terms coming out of Catherine's mouth today. And it's going to be commented on. Another term that doesn't exactly mean the same thing back then as it does now is the word nice. Nice is in, oh, you're so nice. Thanks for doing that. Is not really the way it was being used. Nice was more like fastidious, or something that was refined, or something that was particularly nice. So someone who used nice language was actually somebody who was using precise language, perhaps to say something that we would consider nice, but it had more to do with precision and kind of the beauty that comes from that kind of precision as well. When people bought books, I did not know this at all. And I'm surprised that this really never dawned on me before, but now, of course, it makes sense. We've, of course, heard of Shakespeare's folios and quartos. And if you listen to Aaron Ziegler and Chopbard podcast, you've heard his much better explanation than what I'm about to give. But books were printed, everything was printed on very large sheets of paper. And then things were done to those very large sheets of paper. They could be folded twice, and that would give you a folio. And you would have to have a knife to cut those folds in order to open the entire thing. We've seen that in some previous books where a guy was at the table in the morning and he brought out a book that had come in the mail, or a magazine that had come in the mail, and he'd taken out a knife and was cutting the pages. So you could have a folio that's folded twice. A document that's folded 4 times would be a quarto. You see where this is going. Folded 8 times would be an octavo, right? A duodecimo would be something that was folded 12 times. Now, the other part of this is that every time you fold the papers, the book gets smaller in dimension. It gets bigger in thickness, but smaller in dimension. So you can wind up with a book that is, 8 by 12. I'm making these numbers up. And then you could go down, if you kept folding and folding and folding, you wind up with one that's like 3 by 5 and 2 inches thick. That is where you get the folio, quarto, octavo, and duodecimo. Here's the other thing I didn't know. Just like there wasn't really any off-the-rack, ready-to-wear clothing, or at least not much of it, there was also the idea that you would buy a book unbound. Now the lending libraries make a whole lot more sense, because it was the only way you could get your hands on a book right then. Because otherwise you would go to a bookseller's, you would buy the book unbound, you would pay to have it bound. So it's already been printed out to be a folio, a quarto, an octavo, or a duodecimo, but it would be loose sheets of paper. And then you'd pay them to take it into the back, cut it, trim it, stitch it together, stitch the signatures together, and then boom, you have a book. Jane Austen evidently in one of her letters was talking to her sister Cassandra and said that the binding compressed the book marvelously, so she had more room in her bag, in her luggage, because now the book was considerably smaller. So that's referred to, that's what they're talking about with the unbound books. I know that we've talked before about several of the people who are going to get mentioned in chapter 14. Samuel Johnson, he was a great expert on the English language. He was a writer of an early dictionary, very well respected. There was Hugh Blair, who was a Scottish rhetorician. I said it right. He was a huge proponent of precise speech, and you will see that Henry Tilney really likes Hugh Blair. David Hume, you've probably heard of him before. He's a big philosopher of the time. And then there was William Robertson, who was a writer of history. He was a bestseller kind of writer of history as well. He wrote a history of Scotland, of India, of the Americas, of the Emperor Charles V. He was well known for writing histories. People read them all. And now that we're getting close to history, here is a little bit. Caractacus was a tribal leader in Britain before Britain was unified, and he was a biggie who fought against the Roman invasion. There was Agricola, who was the Roman general who was one of the ones doing the invading. And then there's Alfred the Great, who came along quite a bit later, who in the 9th century was the guy who unified England, I think. I think he might be the only king of England who is regularly referred to as the Great. You have other greats, Alexander the Great, all that. But in English history, the history of Britain, early Britain, I think he's the only one who's a great, which is kind of cool. Once we got rolling on this whole history topic, Henry Tilney gets going, and he starts in a very funny way. He uses history to change the subject because he knows it's boring for Catherine. So he's going to go through a whole list of, and I think he does it twice actually, of historic political movements within the country. There was the enclosure movement where land was being taken over for agriculture, but it meant the decrease of the woodlands and wastelands, and that changed the landscape in Britain quite a bit. There were wars and commotions and fights and all of this stuff that he mentions. This is also kind of a tongue-in-cheek moment for Jane Austen. And I've mentioned this before, I think in the first episode where we were doing this. Jane Austen, when she was 15 years old, wrote a 34-page manuscript with 13 watercolor miniatures painted by her sister Cassandra, and it was called The History of England, written by a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. You can get this. You can also get this on audio. It is funny. It's inconsistently funny, but when it's funny, it's funny. She is absolutely the wit that you know she is, and it's kind of marvelous. So the discussions between Catherine and Henry and Henry's sister about history are just fun, especially if you know that about Jane Austen. And just a reminder on that same front, women did read tons of novels at the time, but men read lots of novels as well. And we know this because of those lending libraries, the circulating libraries. People signed up for them and signed out books, and we have those records. Henry's about 8 years older than Catherine, so he's finished school. He is out of school. He is a working grown-up person. A brickbat. I have heard this word used for so long, and I never thought to look it up. It's just a chunk of brick, not surprisingly, it being called a brick bat, but it's not a bat. It's like if you were throwing chunks of brick at the police or an invading army, and all you had to fight with was rubble. You take a chunk of brick and you throw it. And that is a brickbat. The town of Clifton. The town of Clifton was where you went in the summertime and not Bath. So when Bath's season is up, Clifton's is down. When Clifton's season is up, Bath's is down back then. It is also a spa town, just a smaller one. Spars. Spars are little crystalline clusters that you could buy as a souvenir. You can still buy the same thing, but it's little spars of crystal. So when they talk about spars, that's all they're talking about. A sarcenet is a very fine silk dress. Sarsen comes from Saracen, which comes from Syria. It's another one of those terms that kind of over time lost its original meaning. It was tied to the Crusades and people who were actually maybe nomadic because it was between Syria and what's now Saudi Arabia, I think. But a sarcenet is basically describing the style of silk that's being used for making that particular dress. So it would be lovely, lightweight, probably colorful, and and silk. So that wouldn't stink. Don't forget that buying, owning, keeping, upkeep of a carriage, any carriage, was an enormous investment. And really, truly, most people did not have carriages at this time. It was propitious that Tara spoke of calling cards and visiting cards because you are going to hear them referred to yet a third way. So we have calling cards, visiting cards, and now tickets. All three mean the same thing. It is your name on a card. The card is the card that you would leave at the home of somebody that you went to visit. Hoop rings. These would be simple rings, often, I don't want to say encrusted with, but inlaid with small gemstones. So you could stack several of these kinds of hoop rings onto your finger all at the same time. We see very similar styles now with multiple rings on fingers. Same thing was done back then. So it was exactly what you think it is. And then Devizes is a town between Bath and London. It's about 15 miles from Bath. Bath is about 105 miles from London, so it's not even sort of halfway there. But it does get mentioned in the chapters today. I think that's everything you need to know to get the jokes in today's chapters. So let's listen, chapters 14 and 15 of Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, read to us by Mia Daguerre. Here we go.
Chapter 14. The next morning was fair, and Catherine almost expected another attack from the assembled party. With Mr. Allen to support her, she felt no dread of the event, but she would gladly be spared a contest where victory itself was painful, and was heartily rejoiced, therefore, at neither seeing nor hearing anything of them. The Tilneys called for her at the appointed time, and no new difficulty arising, no sudden recollection, no unexpected summons, no impertinent intrusion to disconcert their measures, my heroine was most unnaturally able to fulfil her engagement, though it was made with the hero himself. They determined on walking round Beecham Cliff, that noble hill whose beautiful verdure and hanging coppice render it so striking an object from almost every opening in Bath. "I never look at it," said Catherine as they walked along the side of the river, "without thinking of the south of France." "You've been abroad, then?" said Henry, a little surprised. "Oh, no, I only mean what I have read about. It always puts me in mind of the country that Emily and her father travelled through in the Mysteries of Udolpho. But you never read novels, I dare say." "Why not?" "Because they're not clever enough for you. Gentlemen read better books." "The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid. I have read all Mrs. Radcliffe's works, and most of them with great pleasure. The Mysteries of Udolpho, when I had once begun it, I could not lay it down again. I remember finishing it in 2 days, my hair standing on end the whole time." "Yes," added Miss Tilney, "and I remember that you undertook to read it aloud to me. And when I was called away for only 5 minutes to answer a note, instead of waiting for me, you took the volume into the Hermitage Walk, and I was obliged to stay till you had finished it." "Thank you, Eleanor, a most honourable testimony. You see, Miss Morland, the injustice of your suspicions. Here was I, in my eagerness to get on, refusing to wait only 5 minutes for my sister, breaking the promise I had made of reading it aloud, and keeping her in suspense at a most interesting part by running away with the volume, which, you are to observe, was her own, particularly her own. I'm proud when I reflect on it, and I think it must establish me in your good opinion. I am very glad to hear it, indeed, and now I shall never be ashamed of liking Udolpho myself. But I really thought before young men despised novels amazingly. It is amazingly. It may well suggest amazement if they do, for they read nearly as many as women. I myself have read hundreds and hundreds. Do not imagine that you can cope with me in a knowledge of Julia's and Louisa's. If we proceed to particulars, and engage in the never-ceasing inquiry of have you read this, and have you read that, I shall soon leave you far behind me as, what shall I say? I want an appropriate simile. As far as your friend Emily herself left poor Valancourt when she went with her aunt into Italy. Consider how many years I have had the start of you. I had entered on my studies at Oxford when you were a good little girl working your sampler at home. Not very good, I'm afraid. But now really, do you not think Udolpho the nicest book in the world? The nicest? By which I suppose you mean the neatest. That must depend on the binding. Henry, said Miss Tilney, you are very impertinent. Miss Morland, he is treating you exactly as he does his sister. He's forever finding fault with me for some incorrectness of language, and now he's taken the same liberty with you. The word nicest, as you used it, did not suit him, and you'd better change it as soon as you can, or we shall be overpowered with Johnson and Blair all the rest of the way. I'm sure, cried Catherine, I did not mean to say anything wrong, but it is a nice book, and why should I not call it so? Very true, said Henry, and this is a very nice day, and we're taking a very nice walk, and you are two very nice young ladies. Oh, it is a very nice word indeed. It does for everything. Originally, perhaps, it was applied only to express neatness, propriety, delicacy, or refinement. People were nice in their dress, in their sentiments, or their choice. But now every commendation on every subject is comprised in that one word. Well, in fact, cried his sister, it ought only to be applied to you without any commendation at all. You are more nice than wise. Come, Miss Morland, let us leave him to meditate over our faults in the utmost propriety of diction, while we praise Udolpho in whatever terms we like best. It is a most interesting work. You are fond of that kind of reading? To say the truth, I do not much like any other. Indeed. That is, I can read poetry and plays and things of that sort, and I do not dislike travels. But history, real solemn history, I cannot be interested in. Can you? Yes, I'm very fond of history. I wish I were too. I read it a little as a duty, but it tells me nothing that does not either vex or weary me. The quarrels of popes and kings, with wars or pestilences in every page, the men all so good for nothing and hardly any women at all, is very tiresome. Yet I often think it odd that it should be so dull, for a great deal of it must be invention. The speeches that are put into the heroes' mouths, their thoughts and designs, the chief of all this must be invention, and invention is what delights me in other books. Historians, you think, said Miss Tilney, are not happy in their flights of fancy. They display imagination without raising interest. I'm fond of history, and I'm very well content to take the false with the true. In the principal facts they have sources of intelligence in former histories and records, which may be as much depended on, I conclude, as anything that does not actually pass under one's own observation. And as for the little embellishments you speak of, they are embellishments, and I like them as such. If a speech may be well drawn up, I read it with pleasure, by whomsoever it be made, and probably with much greater if the production of Mr. Hume or Mr. Robertson, than if the genuine words of Caractacus, Agricola, or Alfred the Great. You are fond of history, and so are Mr. Allen and my father, and I have 2 brothers who do not dislike it. So many instances within my small circle of friends is remarkable. At this rate I shall not pity the writers of history any longer. If people like to read their books, it's all very well. But to be at so much trouble in filling great volumes, which, as I used to think, nobody would willingly ever look into, to be labouring only for the torment of little boys and girls, always struck me as a hard fate. And though I know it is very right and necessary, I've often wondered at the person's courage that could sit down on purpose to do it. That little boys and girls should be tormented, said Henry, is what no one at all acquainted with human nature in a civilised state can deny. But in behalf of our most distinguished historians, I must observe that they might well be offended at being supposed to have no great higher aim, and that by their method and style they're perfectly well qualified to torment readers of the most advanced reason and mature time of life. I use the verb to torment, as I observe to be your own method, instead of to instruct, supposing them now to be admitted as synonyms. You think me foolish to call instruction a torment, but if you had been as much used as myself to hear poor little children first learning their letters, then learning to spell, if you'd ever seen how stupid they can be for a whole morning together, and how tired my poor mother is at the end of it, as I am in the habit of seeing almost every day of my life at home, you would allow that to torment and to instruct might sometimes be used as synonymous words. Very probably. But historians are not accountable for the difficulty of learning to read, and even you yourself, who do not altogether seem particularly friendly to very severe, very intense application, may perhaps be brought to acknowledge that it's very worthwhile to be tormented for 2 or 3 years of one's life for the sake of being able to read all the rest of it. Consider, if reading had not been taught, Mrs. Radcliffe would have written in vain, or perhaps might not have written at all. Catherine assented, and a very warm panegyric from her on that lady's merits closed the subject. The Tilneys were soon engaged in another on which she had nothing to say. They were viewing the country with the eyes of persons accustomed to drawing, and decided on its capability of being formed into pictures with all the eagerness of real taste. Here Catherine was quite lost. She knew nothing of drawing, nothing of taste, and she listened to them with an attention which brought her little profit, for they talked in phrases which conveyed scarcely any idea to her. The little which she could understand, however, appeared to contradict the very few notions she had entertained on the matter before, and seemed as if a good view were no longer to be taken from the top of a high hill, and that a clear blue sky was no longer proof of a fine day. She was heartily ashamed of her ignorance, a misplaced shame. Where people wish to attach, they should always be ignorant. To come with a well-informed mind is to come with an inability of administering to the vanity of others, which a sensible person would always wish to avoid. A woman, especially if she have the misfortune of knowing anything, should conceal it as well as she can. The advantages of a natural folly in a beautiful girl have already been set forth by the capital pen of a sister author, and to her treatment of the subject I will only add, in justice to men, that though to the larger and more trifling part of the sex, imbecility in females is the greatest enhancement of their personal charms, there is a portion of them too reasonable and too well informed themselves to desire anything more in a woman than ignorance. But Catherine did not know her own advantages, did not know that a good-looking girl with an affectionate heart and a very ignorant mind cannot fail of attracting a clever young man, unless circumstances are particularly untoward. In the present instance she confessed and lamented her want of knowledge, declared that she would give anything in the world to be able to draw, and a lecture on the picturesque immediately followed, in which his instructions were so clear that she soon began to see the beauty in everything admired by him, and her attention was so earnest that he became perfectly satisfied of her, having a great deal of natural taste. He talked of foregrounds, distances, second distances, side screens and perspectives, lights and shades, and Catherine was so hopeful a scholar that when they gained the top of beach and cliff, she voluntarily rejected the whole city of Bath as unworthy to make part of a landscape. Delighted with her progress, and fearful of wearying her with too much wisdom at once, Henry suffered the subject to decline, and by an easy transition from a piece of rocky fragment and a withered oak which he had placed near its summit, to oaks in general, to forests, the enclosures of them, wastelands, crown lands and government, he shortly found himself arrived at politics, and from politics it was an easy step to silence. The general pause which succeeded his short disquisition on the state of the nation was to be put an end to by Catherine, who in rather a solemn tone of voice uttered these words: "I have heard something very shocking indeed will soon come out in London." Miss Tilney, to whom this was chiefly addressed, was startled, and hastily replied, "Indeed, and of what nature?" "That I do not know, nor who is the author. I have only heard that it is to be more horrible than anything we've met with yet." "Good heaven! Where could you hear of such a thing? A particular friend of mine had an account of it in a letter from London yesterday. It is to be uncommonly dreadful. I shall expect murder and everything of the kind. You speak with astonishing composure, but I hope your friend's accounts have been exaggerated, and if such a design is known beforehand, proper measures will undoubtedly be taken by government to prevent its coming to effect. Government, said Henry, endeavouring not to smile, neither desires nor dares to interfere in such matters. There must be murder, and government cares not how much. The ladies stared. He laughed and added, Come, shall I make you understand each other, or leave you to puzzle out an explanation as you can? No, I will be noble. I will prove myself a man no less by the generosity of my soul than the clearness of my head. I have no patience with such of my sex as disdain to let themselves sometimes down to the comprehension of yours. Perhaps the ability of women are neither sound nor acute, neither vigorous nor keen. Perhaps they want observation, discernment, judgment, fire, genius, wit. Miss Morland, do not mind what he says, but have the goodness to satisfy me as to this dreadful riot. Riot? What riot? My dear Eleanor, the riot is only in your own brain. The confusion there is scandalous. Miss Morland has been talking of nothing more dreadful than a new publication which is shortly to come out, in 3 duodecimal volumes, 276 pages in each, with a frontispiece to the first of 2 tombstones and a lantern. Do you understand? And you, Miss Morland, my stupid sister has mistaken all your clearest expressions. You talked of expected horrors in London, and instead of instantly conceiving, as any rational creature would have done, that such words could relate only to a circulating library, she immediately pictured herself a mob of 3,000 men assembling in St. George's Fields, the Bank attacked, the Tower threatened, the streets of London flowing with blood, a detachment of the 12th Light Dragoons, the hopes of the nation called up from Northampton to quell the insurgents, and the gallant Captain Frederick Tilney, in the moment of charging at the head of his troop, knocked off his horse by a brickbat from an upper window. Forgive her stupidity. The fears of the sister have added to the weaknesses of women, but she is by no means a simpleton in general. Catherine looked grave. And now, Henry, said Miss Tilney, that you have made us understand each other, you may as well make Miss Morland understand yourself, unless you mean to have her think you intolerably rude to your sister, and a great brute in your opinion of women in general. Miss Morland is not used to your odd ways. I shall be most happy to make her better acquainted with them. No doubt, but that's no explanation of the present. What am I to do? You know what you ought to do. Clear your character handsomely before her. Tell her that you think very highly of the understanding of women. Miss Morland, I think very highly of the understanding of all the women in the world, especially of those, whoever they may be, with whom I happen to be in company. That is not enough. Be more serious. Miss Morland, no one can think more highly of the understanding of women than I do. In my opinion, nature has given them so much that they never find it necessary to use more than half. We shall get nothing more serious from him now, Miss Morland. He is not in a sober mood, but I assure you that he must be entirely misunderstood if he can ever appear to say an unjust thing of any woman at all, or an unkind one of me. It was no effort of Catherine to believe that Henry Tilney could never be wrong. His manner might sometimes surprise, but his meaning must always be just, and what she did not understand she was almost as ready to admire as what she did. The whole walk was delightful, and though it ended too soon, its conclusion was delightful too. Her friends attended her into the house, and Miss Tilney, before they parted, addressing herself with respectful form as much to Mrs. Allen as to Catherine, petitioned for the pleasure of her company to dinner on the day after the next. No difficulty was made on Mrs. Allen's side, and the only difficulty on Catherine's was in concealing the excess of her pleasure. The morning had passed away so charmingly as to banish all her friendship and natural affection, for no thought of Isabella or James crossed her mind during their walk. When the Tilneys were gone, she became amiable again, but she was amiable for some time with little effect. Mrs. Allen had no intelligence to give that could relieve her anxiety. She had heard nothing of any of them. Towards the end of the morning, however, Catherine, having occasion for some indispensable yard of ribbon, which must be bought without a moment's delay, walked out into the town, and in Bond Street overtook the second Miss Thorpe, as she was loitering towards Edgar's buildings between two of the sweetest girls in the world, who had been her dear friends all the morning. From her she soon learned that the party to Clifton had taken place. "They set off at 8 this morning," said Miss Anne, "and I'm sure I do not envy them their drive. I think you and I are very well off to be out of the scrape. It must be the dullest thing in the world, for there is not a soul at Clifton at this time of the year. Belle went with your brother, and John drove Maria." Catherine spoke the pleasure she really felt on hearing this part of the arrangement. "Oh, yes," rejoined the other, "Maria is gone. She was quite wild to go. She thought it would be something very fine. I cannot say I admire her taste, and for my part I was determined from the first not to go, if they pressed me ever so much." Catherine, a little doubtful of this, could not help answering, "I wish you could have gone too. It's a pity you could not all go." "Thank you, but it is quite a matter of indifference to me." "Indeed, I would not have gone on any account. I was saying so to Emily and Sophia when you overtook us." Catherine was still unconvinced, but glad that Anne should have the friendship of an Emily and a Sophia to console her. She bade her adieu without much uneasiness, and returned home, pleased that the party had not been prevented by her refusing to join it, and very heartily wishing that it might be too pleasant to allow either James or Isabella to resent her resistance any longer. Chapter 15. Early the next day, a note from Isabella speaking peace and tenderness in every line, and entreating the immediate presence of her friend on a matter of the utmost importance, hastened Catherine, in the happiest state of confidence and curiosity, to Edgar's buildings. The two youngest Miss Thorpes were by themselves in the parlour, and on Anne's quitting it to call her sister, Catherine took the opportunity of asking the other for some particulars of their yesterday's party. Maria desired no greater pleasure than to speak of it, and Catherine immediately learned that it had been altogether the most delightful scheme in the world, that nobody could imagine how charming it had been, and that it had been more delightful than anybody could conceive. Such was the information for the first 5 minutes. The second unfolded thus much in detail, that they had driven directly to the York Hotel, ate some soup, bespoke an early dinner, walked down to the pump-room, tasted the water, and laid out some shillings in purses and spars, thence adjourned to eat ice at her pastry-cook's, and hurrying back to the hotel, swallowed their dinner in haste, to prevent being in the dark, and then had a delightful drive back. Only the moon was not up, and it rained a little, and Mr. Morland's horse was so tired he could hardly get it along. Catherine listened with heartfelt satisfaction. It appeared that Blaise Castle had never been thought of, and as for all the rest, there was nothing to regret for half an instant. Maria's intelligence concluded with a tender effusion of pity for her sister Anne, whom she represented as insupportably cross from being excluded the party. "She will never forgive me, I'm sure. But you know, how could I help it? John would have me go, for he vowed he would not drive her because she had such thick ankles. I dare say she will not be in good humour again this month. But I'm determined that I will not be cross. It is not a little matter that puts me out of temper." Isabella now entered the room with so eager a step and a look of such happy importance as engaged all her friends' notice. Maria was without ceremony sent away, and Isabella, embracing Catherine, thus began. "Yes, my dear Catherine, it is so indeed. Your penetration has not deceived you. Oh, that arch eye of yours, it sees through everything." Catherine replied only by a look of wondering ignorance. "Nay, beloved, sweetest friend," continued the other, "compose yourself. I am amazingly agitated, as you perceive. Let us sit down and talk in comfort. Well, and so you guessed it the moment you had my note. Sly creature! Oh, my dear Catherine, you alone who know my heart can judge of my present happiness. Your brother is the most charming of men. I only wish I were more worthy of him. But what will your excellent father and mother say? Oh, heavens, when I think of them, I'm so agitated." Catherine's understanding began to awake. An idea of the truth suddenly darted into her mind, and with the natural blush of so new an emotion, she cried out, "Good heaven! My dear Isabella, what do you mean? Can you really be in love with James?" This bold surmise, however, she soon learnt comprehended but half the fact. The anxious affection which she was accused of having continually watched in Isabella's every look and action had, in the course of their yesterday's party, received the delightful confession of an equal love. Her heart and faith were alike engaged to James. Never had Catherine listened to anything so full of interest, wonder, and joy. Her brother and friend engaged! New to such circumstances, the importance of it appeared unspeakably great, and she contemplated it as one of those grand events of which the ordinary course in life can hardly afford a return. The strength of her feelings she could not express. The nature of them, however, contented her friend. The happiness of having such a sister was their first effusion, and the fair ladies mingled in embraces and tears of joy. Delighting, however, as Catherine sincerely did in the prospect of the connection, it must be acknowledged that Isabella far surpassed her in tender anticipations. "You will be so infinitely dearer to me, my Catherine, than either Anne or Maria. I feel that I should be so much more attached to my dear Morland's family than to my own." This was a pitch of friendship beyond Catherine. "You are so like your dear brother," continued Isabella, "that I quite doted on you the first moment I saw you. But so it is always with me. The first moment settles everything. The very first day that Morland came to us last Christmas, the very first moment I beheld him, my heart was irrevocably gone. I remember I wore my yellow gown with my hair done up in braids, and when I came into the drawing-room and John introduced him, I thought I never saw anyone so handsome before." Here Catherine secretly acknowledged the power of love, for though exceedingly fond of her brother and partial to all his endowments, she had never in her life thought him handsome. "I remember, too, Miss Andrews drank tea with us that evening and wore her puce-coloured sarcenet, and she looked so heavenly that I thought your brother must certainly fall in love with her. I could not sleep a wink all night for thinking of it. Oh, Catherine, the many sleepless nights I've had on your brother's account! I would not have you suffer half of what I have done. I am grown wretchedly thin, I know, but I will not pain you by describing my anxiety. You have seen enough of it. I feel that I have betrayed myself perpetually, so unguarded in speaking of my partiality for the church. But my secret, I was always sure, would be safe with you." Catherine felt that nothing could have been safer, for ashamed of an ignorance little expected, she dared no longer contest the point, nor refuse to have been as full of arch penetration and affectionate sympathy as Isabella chose to consider her. Her brother, she found, was preparing to set off with all speed to Fullerton to make known his situation and ask consent, and here was a source of some real agitation to the mind of Isabella. Catherine endeavoured to persuade her, as she was herself persuaded, that her father and mother would never oppose their son's wishes. "It is impossible," she said, "for parents to be more kind or more desirous of their children's happiness. I have no doubt of their consenting immediately." "Morland says exactly the same," replied Isabella, "and yet I dare not expect it. My fortune will be so small they can never consent to it. Your brother, who might marry anybody." Here Catherine again discerned the force of love. "Indeed, Isabella, you are too humble. The difference of fortune can be nothing to signify." "Oh, my sweet Catherine, in your generous heart I know it would signify nothing, but we must not expect such disinterestedness in many. As for myself, I'm sure I only wish our situations were reversed. Had I the command of millions, were I the mistress of the whole world, your brother would be my only choice." This charming sentiment, recommended as much by sense as novelty, gave Catherine a most pleasing remembrance of all the heroines of her acquaintance, and she thought her friend never looked more lovely than in uttering the grand idea. "I'm sure they will consent," was her frequent declaration. "I'm sure they will be delighted with you." "For my own part," said Isabella, "my wishes are so moderate that the smallest income in nature would be enough for me. Where people are really attached, poverty itself is wealth. Grandeur I detest. I would not settle in London for the universe. A cottage in some retired village would be ecstasy. There are some charming little villas about Richmond." "Richmond?" cried Catherine. "You must settle near Fullerton. You must be near us." "I'm sure I shall be miserable if we do not. If I can but be near you, I shall be satisfied. But this is idle talking. I will not allow myself to think of such things till we have your father's answer. Morland says that by sending it tonight to Salisbury, we might have it tomorrow." "Tomorrow! I know I shall never have the courage to open the letter. I know it will be the death of me." A reverie succeeded this conviction, and when Isabella spoke again, it was to resolve on the quality of her wedding gown. Their conference was put an end to by the anxious young lover himself, who came to breathe his parting sigh before he set off for Wiltshire. Catherine wished to congratulate him, but knew not what to say, and her eloquence was only in her eyes. For them, however, the 8 parts of speech shone out most expressively, and James could combine them with ease. Impatient for the realization of all that he hoped at home, his adieus were not long, and they would have been yet shorter had he not been frequently detained by the urgent entreaties of his fair one that he would go. Twice he was called, almost from the door, by her eagerness to have him gone. "Indeed, Morland, I must drive you away. Consider how far you have to ride. I cannot bear to see you linger so. For heaven's sake, waste no more time. There, go, I insist on it." The 2 friends, with hearts now more united than ever, were inseparable for the day, and in schemes of sisterly happiness the hours flew along. Mrs. Thorpe and her son, who were acquainted with everything, and who seemed only to want Mr. Morland's consent to consider Isabel's engagement as the most fortunate circumstance imaginable for their family, were allowed to join their counsels, and add their quota of significant looks and mysterious expressions to fill up the measures of curiosity to be raised in the unprivileged younger sisters. To Catherine's simplest feelings this odd sort of reserve seemed neither kindly meant nor consistently supported, and its unkindness she would hardly have forborne pointing out, had its inconsistency been less their friend. But Anne and Maria soon set her heart at ease by the sagacity of their I-know-what, and the evening was spent in a sort of war of wit, a display of family ingenuity. On one side in the mystery of an affected secret, on the other of undefined discovery, all equally acute. Catherine was with her friend again the next day, endeavouring to support her spirits, and while away the many tedious hours before the delivery of the letters. A needful excursion, for as the time of reasonable expectation drew near, Isabella became more and more desponding, and before the letter arrived had worked herself into a state of real distress. But when it did come, where could distress be found? "I have had no difficulty in gaining the consent of my kind parents, and am promised it that everything in their power shall be done to forward my happiness," were the first 3 lines. And in one moment all was joyful security. The brightest glow was instantly spread over Isabella's features, all care and anxiety seemed removed, her spirits became almost too high for control, and she called herself without scruple the happiest of mortals. Mrs. Thorpe, with tears of joy, embraced her daughter, her son, her visitor, and could have embraced half the inhabitants of Bath with satisfaction. Her heart was overflowing with tenderness. It was dear John and dear Catherine at every word. Dear Anne, dear Maria, must immediately be made sharers in their felicity, and 2 dears at once before the name of Isabella were not more than that beloved child had now well earned. John himself was no sulkier in joy. He only bestowed on Mr. Morland the high commendation of being one of the finest fellows in the world, but swore off many sentences in his praise. The letter, whence sprang all this felicity, was short, containing little more than this assurance of success, and every particular was deferred till James could write again. But for particulars Isabella could well afford to wait. The needful was comprised in Mr. Morland's promise. His honour was pledged to make everything easy, and by what means their income was to be formed, whether landed property was to be resigned, or funded money made over, was a matter in which her disinterested spirit took no concern. She knew enough to feel secure and of an honourable and speedy establishment, and her imagination took a rapid flight over its intended felicities. She saw herself, at the end of a few weeks, the gaze and admiration of every new acquaintance at Fullerton, the envy of every valued old friend in Pulteney, with a carriage at her command, a new name on her tickets, and a brilliant exhibition of hoop rings on her finger. When the contents of the letter were ascertained, John Thorpe, who had only waited its arrival to begin his journey to London, prepared to set off. "Well, Miss Morland," said he, on finding her alone in the parlour, "I am come to bid you good-bye." Catherine wished him a good journey. Without appearing to hear her, he walked to the window, fidgeted about, hummed a tune, and seemed wholly self-occupied. "Shall you not be late at Devizes?" said Catherine. He made no answer, but after a minute's silence burst out with, "A famous good thing this marrying scheme, upon my soul. A clever fancy of Morland's and Bell's. What do you think of it, Miss Morland? I say it's no bad notion. I'm sure I think it's a very good one. Do you? That is honest, by heavens. I'm glad you're no enemy to matrimony, however. Did you ever hear the old song, going to one wedding brings on another? I say, you'll come to Belle's wedding, I hope. Yes, I've promised your sister to be with her, if possible. And then, you know, twisting himself about and forcing a foolish laugh, I say, then, you know, we might try the truth of this same old song. May we? But I never sing. Well, I wish you a good journey. I dine with Miss Tilney tonight and must now be going home. Nay, but there's no such confounded hurry. Who knows when we may be together again? Not that I shall be down again by the end of the fortnight, and a devilish long fortnight it will appear to me. Then why do you stay away so long? Replied Catherine, finding that he waited for an answer. That is kind of you, however, kind and good-natured. I shall not forget it in a hurry. But you have more good nature and all that than anybody living, I believe. A monstrous deal of good nature. And it's not only good nature, but you have so much of everything, and then you have such... Upon my soul, I do not know anybody like you. Oh dear, there are a great many people like me, I dare say, only a great deal better. Good morning to you. But I say, Miss Morland, I shall come and pay my respects at Fullerton before it is long, if not disagreeable. Pray do. My father and mother will be glad to see you. And I hope, Miss Morland, you will not be sorry to see me. Oh dear, not at all. There are very few people I'm sorry to see. Company is always cheerful. That is just my way of thinking. Give me but a little cheerful company. Let me only have the company of the people I love. Let me only be where I like and with whom I like, and the devil take the rest, say I. And I am heartily glad to hear you say the same. But I have a notion, Miss Morland, you and I think pretty much alike on most matters. Perhaps we may, but it's more than I ever thought of. And as to most matters, to say the truth, there are not many that I know my own mind about. By Jove, no more do I. It is not my way to bother my brains with what does not concern me. My notion of things is simple enough. Let me only have the girl I like, say I, with a comfortable house over my head, and what care I for all the rest? Fortune is nothing. I'm sure of a good income of my own, and if she had not a penny, why so much the better. Very true, I think like you there. If there's a good fortune in one side, then there can be no occasion for any on the other, no matter which has it, so that there is enough. I hate the idea of one great fortune looking out for another, and to marry for money I think the wickedest thing in existence. Good day. We shall be very glad to see you at Fullerton whenever is convenient. And away she went. It was not in the power of all his gallantry to detain her longer. With such news to communicate and such a visit to prepare for, her departure was not to be delayed by anything in his nature to urge, and she hurried away, leaving him to the undivided consciousness of his own happy addresses and her explicit encouragement. The agitation which he had herself experienced on first learning her brother's engagement made her expect to raise no considerable emotion in Mr. and Mrs. Allen by the communication of the wonderful event. How great was her disappointment! The important affair which many words of preparation ushered in had been foreseen by them both ever since her brother's arrival, and all that they felt on the occasion was comprehended in a wish for the young people's happiness, with a remark on the gentleman's side in favour of Isabella's beauty, and on the lady's of her great good luck. It was to Catherine the most surprising insensibility. The disclosure, however, of the great secret of James's going to Fullerton the day before did raise some emotion in Mrs. Allen. She could not listen to that with perfect calmness, but repeatedly regretted the necessity of its concealment, wished she could have seen him before he went, as she should certainly have troubled him with her best regards to his father and mother, and her kind compliments to all the Skinners.
And that ends volume 1 of our book. So it was released as a 2-volume set. We have now reached the midpoint. We are halfway through and at the end of volume 1. So I've saved a couple of things to go over with you. One of them, I'm actually just going to read an annotation to you because it's quite complex, but we're going to get to that in a second. First is, did you notice that as Catherine was learning about drawing and seeing the world through an artist's eyes, she then took that information and totally blew it up. And suddenly Wow, this view of Bath really stinks. This is horrible. I I now know so much more. I recognize not beauty as well as beauty. And of course, that's crazy. It's a beautiful view of the city. And so Henry, in his attempt to pull her back from that ledge of disparaging beauty now, starts to go into politics and history because he knows that that'll bore her. And eventually, politics leads to silence, which I just loved. That is also, it's hard to differentiate if that's Catherine being Catherine or if that's Catherine being Isabella. If it's just that she's picked up bad habits from Isabella, the way that Isabella gets pretty hyperbolic about things. Hard to know. But there's a lovely chunk of this chapter where Austen inserts herself as a kind of a narrative voice. And it's when they're having their conversation back and forth about women basically being intelligent or not. It is also clear that Henry is really just poking fun at his sister. He absolutely does not think she is an idiot. And she's pretty clear on that at the end as well. He's just having a go at them. However, the whole idea, and we've seen it before in other books, we've certainly talked about it before, of young girls feeling like, or even being told, that being too smart is not good, or at least showing that you're smart is not so good because then guys won't like you. Clearly, that is being bandied about at this time. So, in the section in chapter 14, where Catherine starts by saying she was heartily ashamed of her ignorance, a misplaced shame. Where people wish to attach, they should always be ignorant. To come with a well-informed mind is to come with an inability of administering to the vanity of others, which a sensible person would always wish to avoid. A woman especially, if she have the misfortune of knowing anything, should conceal it as well as she can. And there are actual etiquette books of the time that said basically this. And there's a quote here from a very popular bestseller by John Gregory. It's called A Father's Legacy to His Daughters from 1774. So this is the excerpt. The first line alone. Maybe you should sit down. Be even cautious of displaying your good sense. It will be thought you assume a superiority over the rest of the company. But if you happen to have any learning, keep it a profound secret, especially from the men who generally look with a jealous and malignant eye on a woman of great parts and a cultivated understanding. A man of real genius and candor is far superior to this meanness, but such a one will seldom fall in your way, and if by accident he should, do not be anxious to show the full extent of your knowledge. The great art of pleasing in conversation consists in making the company pleased with themselves. You will more readily hear than talk yourself into their good graces. Now, that was not a universal attitude, but it was certainly out there. There was a debate at the time about female education and whether it was useful or not, or troublemaking or not, but it was certainly a conversation that was being had. And in fact, in another book of the time, Frances Burney, in Camilla, there's a kind of beautiful but not too bright girl. And in one chapter, a narrow-minded woman hired to be her tutor warns her guardian against giving her a serious education. And here's the quote from that. "Consider, sir," she cried, "what an obstacle it will prove to her making her way in the great world when she comes to be of proper age for thinking of an established marriage. What gentleman will you ever find that will bear with a learned wife, except some mere downright forgum, which would be like an old fogey, that no young lady of fashion could endure?" Ah, yes, yes. And that was written by a woman. Of course, it's very possible, we would like to think, that that was being written as not the right way of thinking, and it would be nice if we were able to continue thinking that, but in fact, it didn't work out so well for her. Jane Austen, on the other hand, of course, was quite encouraged to learn and grow and read and be educated. And it wasn't that she didn't have prospects. We know there was the movie version of the story, but we do know that she did fall in love with a young man at one point, and they both agreed that because they had no money together between the two of them, they had no resources. There would be no way that they could live except in poverty. They agreed and realized that this would have been a bad match on a very realistic and honestly very adult understanding. Later, she was also proposed to by an older man for whom she felt no love, and she said no. So it's not that she was alone and, oh, poor Jane. She was just smart, is what it comes down to. And smart clearly was a little controversial at the time. All right, if you're having trouble with the Craftlit app, that is because there have been changes made to the back end that we're trying to catch up with. So it is being fixed. I don't know when it will be fixed. I continue to think that the easiest way, usually, to listen to the podcast is via the app. It'll get there, we think. So we're working on that. Oh, yeah. Next week's episode is coming out almost exactly on our 15th anniversary together. 15 years of almost weekly podcasts of classic fiction. And we haven't run out of books yet. That's so great. I love it. So thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Laura Ricketts, who sent a giant box of gluten-free flours and baking mixes and a donut pan. And I am going to get fat this weekend. Oh my goodness. Thank you, Laura, for that. That was so much fun to open. Aiden's the one who brought the box down and said, "Somebody likes you, I guess," and then walked off in a huff. So thank you for that too. All right, I am going to leave you. You have a great week. Take care of yourselves. Be well. Get a vaccine when you can. Wear a mask even after you get the vaccine. And I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.